Students who score in the 170s typically score perfectly on logic games and then just lose a few points on each of the other sections. So let's think about what it takes to score perfect or close to it on logic games. There are a few things that top performers do differently than other students in order to maximize their success on the logic games section. First of all, they have a plan of attack in which they approach the logic games questions within a game. Then there are a few things they do differently as well in order to see the logic game section from the test maker's perspective. But first, let's look at their plan of attack. They do orientation questions first, then the local questions, then the global questions. Orientation questions are simply that warm-up question you typically see at the beginning of a logic game, asking you for an example of a valid scenario. Then there are the local questions that insert a specific constraint on the game that, when combined with the rules, give you a more constrained scenario. And finally, you have the global questions that are more general in nature. The benefit of doing the logic games questions in this order is that it gives you more valid scenarios, which will allow you to eliminate answer choices more quickly and arrive at the correct answer more efficiently without having to draw as many additional hypothetical scenarios. Now, one of the biggest ways to get into the test maker's perspective is to write your own LSAT logic games from scratch. This, of course, is difficult. It's pretty much as difficult as it sounds, but it is possible to do. I've written several of my own LSAT logic games from scratch of a variety of different question types. These are not simply official LSAT logic games with the topics and variables changed like some prep companies have done. These are actual unofficial logic games that I've created myself of all different types. I've done relative ordering, I've done strict ordering, grouping selection, another grouping selection, grouping matching, another grouping matching. Of course, you're probably thinking, well, Steve has been teaching the LSAT forever. He can do it, but that doesn't mean that I can do it. I'm just a student who is starting off and I don't know anything. How could I write my own logic game? Good news is that you can write your own logic game. In fact, here is an example of a student-written logic game. This, again, also is not simply an official game with the topics and variables changed. This is a completely written from scratch, unofficial logic game that a student wrote. And by the way, all of these games I've shown you here are available for free. There's a link to them below this video if you'd like to check them out. Now, of course, it might seem daunting or difficult for you to write an entire game from scratch, so here's an alternative idea. Instead of writing your own complete game from scratch, what if you wrote your unofficial bonus question for an official logic game? Here's an example of one I've created for you right here. This is modeled on or based upon Prep Test 33 Game 2, the famous Birds in the Forest in-out game. I wrote my own supplemental bonus question for this game. It's based upon LSAC's rules and their initial setup, but this is a question they could have asked. Maybe they even should have asked it, but they didn't. So this is a question I wrote as a supplement. You can look at Test 33 Game 2, look at the rules, create a diagram, and then solve this question in addition to the 6 or 7 or so questions that LSAC wrote for their game. I've written 40 unofficial questions like this for each of the 40 logic games in Prep Tests 29 through 38, as well as many more, and they're linked below this video if you'd like to check them out. I strongly encourage you to write your own logic games, or at least write your own bonus questions for official logic games, and the reason is that this will deepen your understanding of logic games significantly. In particular, how does LSAC create rules that will then lead to inferences, and how does LSAC write incredibly tempting wrong answer choices? One of the things I've done with my own LSAT logic games is I've actually chosen to write some games that are a bit more difficult on average than some of LSAC official games, but they're still, of course, perfectly valid, perfectly useful prep for you. And one of the things that I strove or attempted to do with my games was to lay tempting wrong answer choices for you, to lay traps, because that will help you see how LSAC is playing on common LSAT logical fallacies, common misconceptions that students often make. And of course, you need to spot the traps in order to avoid them. So again, strongly encourage you, write your own games. It is possible, as this student did, and write your own bonus questions at the very least. I assure you that you'll learn a great deal from them. And if you'd like to test them out, then just email them to me and I will share them with the world, with everyone watching and reading out there, if you'd like to get some guinea pigs as an experiment to see whether your logic games are valid and contain no mistakes. It's really a fun exercise. Students have gotten a great deal of benefit out of doing this. So please try it out and let me know what you come up with. I'd love to see what you create with this. Students typically do logical reasoning questions by question stem type. There are even entire books of drills just recategorizing LR questions by their question stems. And that's a perfectly valid practice because, first of all, of course, you have to know what the question's asking in order to be able to solve it. And it's also pretty easy to categorize questions by their question stem. But what if we took a different approach and we categorized each stimulus by its method of reasoning instead? Well, first of all, of course, that would take forever. But it's still a useful exercise to think about. What if we instead were to focus on the method of reasoning in the stimulus and the gap in the stimulus between the evidence and the conclusion? This is a higher level way of thinking about logical reasoning arguments. So let's take a minute to focus on the stimulus. In order to get that LSAT mindset and break into the 170s, we've got to be able to think about logical reasoning questions by their flaws, regardless of question type. We've got to be able to analyze the gap in the argument, again, regardless of the question type. So let's think about a couple of major flaws or gaps we typically see. We'll often see confusion of necessary and sufficient conditions. We'll see correlation causation confusion. We'll see situations where someone confuses what could be the case for what must be the case. These are just a few, of course. There are many more. Now, some stimuli can actually easily be changed from one question stem type into another. If we leave the correct answer choice as it is, or we negate it, or we just change it a little bit, we could change the question stem and still have a perfectly valid LSAT question. So here's a very simple logical reasoning drill question I made up on the spot, just as an example for us here. LSAT doesn't let us publish actual LSAT questions online due to copyright concerns, so that's why I'm not using an actual question here. So the question is, what is an underlying necessary assumption? Take a moment, pause this video, and think about at least one underlying assumption, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so here's what I've come up with. The argument assumes that the reviews weren't all left by friends and family biased in favor of the restaurant owner. If we negate this and say the reviews were all left by friends and family who were biased, then that would destroy the argument's validity. It would destroy the conclusion that we should eat there simply because of the 5-star rating. But like I said, we can translate this argument into a different question type. That's the higher level logical reasoning strategy where we look beyond just the question stem to think about the gap and the argument as a whole. What if we were to turn this into a must-be true question? It must be the case that the reviews are a reliable indication of the restaurant's quality. That is an inference we can derive from this stimulus if we take the stimulus as given. What if we turn it into a flaw question? We could say the argument is fundamentally flawed because it fails to consider the possibility that, or it assumes that, the reviews are a reliable indication of the restaurant's quality. It fails to consider that the reviews may not be a reliable indication of the restaurant's quality. What if we turn it into a strengthening question? It would strengthen the argument if we learned that Yelp had highly advanced filtering technology to remove any biased reviews, so any that remain are perfectly reliable. What if we make it a weakened question? If we said, on the other hand, that reviews on Yelp are known to be biased and unreliable, that would harm the argument because the argument is based upon the idea that these reviews are reliable or indicative of something, or they're relevant for some reason. We could also turn it into a resolve the paradox question. Let's say the stimulus said, we have this one fact, 5-star review average, but we have this other fact, this conclusion, that we should not eat there. How could it be the case that the restaurant has 5 stars, yet we shouldn't eat there? Well, it would help to resolve this seemingly confusing situation if we learned that the reviews are known to be biased and unreliable. That would help to explain why someone would not want to eat at a restaurant even though it had 5 stars. Of course, there are many other gaps in this argument. Maybe there's only one review on the Yelp page, and so this is not a large enough sample size. Maybe the restaurant serves a cuisine that we don't want to eat. Maybe the restaurant is not located conveniently near where we live. Maybe the restaurant is too popular and we'd have to wait a few hours just to eat there. So there are lots of reasons why this argument might be flawed or might be open to question. What I've given here is simply one example. The reason I give you this example, though, is because I want you to start thinking beyond just blindly applying techniques that would apply to a strengthening question or a weakened question or a flaw question. I want you to think about the reasoning in the stimulus itself and to thoroughly understand any gaps contained within the argument, because that's what it takes to score into the 170s. That's what it takes to see the LSAT from the test maker's point of view. So keep this in mind as you move forward with your LSAT logical reasoning prep. Most students spend way too long highlighting, underlining, and taking notes for LSAT reading comp. If you think about it, you only have on average 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage. Sure, some are harder, some are easier, but that is your average. And you have 6 or 7 questions per passage. So if you spend more than 2.5 or 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage and taking all those notes, you're not going to have enough time to evaluate and solve all the questions. In my experience, the students who do best on reading comp mark very little or not at all. All those techniques for highlighting and underlining just don't make sense on LSAT test day when you have limited time. And of course, the digital LSAT has highlighting and underlining tools, but I would not recommend using them. It takes too much time to click around and make all those markings. Furthermore, those markings might hurt you later when you're going back to the passage, you're looking at the text, and you can't unsee what you've drawn or highlighted. You can't remove it easily. Once you've made a marking on the page, you're always going to be looking back to that marking even when you don't want to. So instead, I recommend no marking at all or a very minimal marking system. I recommend noting or marking for viewpoints, which are opinions, theories, and hypotheses, essentially equivalent to conclusions in logical reasoning questions. I recommend marking or noting where the evidence appears. Those could be details and supporting examples. And then finally, the advocates. Who, if anyone, is promoting or advocating a particular position? I'd pay special attention to the viewpoints, especially the author's opinion, if any. That's going to be your number one thing for when you go on to the questions. And speaking of the questions, I found that the best students, the ones who solve reading comp passages most efficiently, don't do the questions in the order given. And there's a reason for that. The general questions, like your main idea, primary purpose, and passage organization questions, all of those you could knock out first. In fact, with just your understanding of the author's opinion and the main idea of the passage, you can probably knock out 2 questions off the bat. Then you could do your detail-oriented questions, which sometimes reference a specific line, and finally save those inferential or most strongly supported questions for last. So again, order of difficulty in which you approach the questions on a passage can help save you time because it builds your understanding of the passage as you go. You're going efficiently, building your momentum, and building your confidence as you go through the reading comprehension passage. So those are my quick tips for 170 plus. I'll be sharing much more, so please subscribe and stay tuned for more. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.